beautiful woman is assassinated in the middle of the night in her own home. And now the search is on for one of the most notorious outlaws in history. Prepare yourself for Appalachia's Deadliest, Lewis Kilgore. Maddie Henderson was born in 1851 in a primitive one-room log cabin beneath the towering chestnuts of Henderson County, North Carolina. By all accounts, her parents were proud of the beautiful baby, and they named her Matilda. And as Matilda grew, her mama took to calling her Maddie as a nickname. And by the time she was a teenager, Maddie had developed and was stunning with long black hair and beautiful come-hither eyes. All the boys dreamed about her. She was literally the most coveted girl in the county, and quite frankly, Maddie used it to her advantage. She could get nearly anything her heart desired with the flash of her smile or the tenderness of her lips. Now, back in those days, once the crops were in the ground and the long days of summer set in, there was always a big event down at the community church to fill the idle time, such as a revival or a guest preacher from the next county over. Folks would look forward to these events for weeks in advance as a welcome diversion from the monotony of the daily grind. But, truth be told, it wasn't the preaching that most folks were excited about. The men folk looked forward to racing horses or shooting contests, and they always took a pocket full of seed to church as their gambling money. And of course, there was always plenty of apple brandy to pass around or sample some of the neighbors' collection. Women, on the other hand, spent the week leading up to the event, busy making pies and cobblers and cooking food for the big picnic after the preaching was over. Many times, they would sell their food or desserts as a way to raise money for the church. And the most common way they did this was with something called box suppers. You see, mountain girls would take the food that they had made with their mama, and they would put it in a box and decorate it with pretty ribbons and such. And at the church, all the boxes would be on display to be auctioned off to the highest bidder. Now, the teenage boys would be saving their pennies for months in anticipation of having enough money to buy the dinner box that was prepared by the prettiest girl. Because if you did, part of the prize was that you got to walk the girl home after church, and competition could be fierce, and many times, fist fights would break out amongst the boys during these auctions. It was at an event like this in 1867 when Maddie was 16 years old and a 17-year-old boy named Jake McCulloch won the auction to purchase Maddie's supper box, barely beating out another boy named Lewis Kilgore. And Jake was the type of fella that bounced around from girl to girl. And since Maddie just happened to be the prettiest girl at the church that day, he had his eyes set on her. But it was little more than infatuation. But you see, it was well known all over Hendersonville that Lewis was madly in love with Maddie, to the point of obsession. Yet Maddie had no interest in Lewis whatsoever. In fact, Maddie had her pa run Lewis off the property twice in the past year when he had brought her flowers and was asking permission to court her. Yet, back in the present, Lewis was crushed when Jake won the auction and took Maddie home, and it would turn out to be something that Lewis would never, ever forget or forgive her for. J.D. Phillips here from the Appalachian Storyteller, and I hope you're enjoying this true story about Lewis Kilgore. Things are really about to take a turn for the worse. If you enjoy stories like this, I hope you consider checking out my new book, The Appalachian Storyteller, which is available right here on the link below. It's full of stories just like this one. And now, back to the story. In the years that followed, Maddie began to change. her reputation became tarnished as she used men for what she could gain from them. And before long, the pretty and popular mountain girl lost her freshness and her charm. The girl who once got her way everywhere she went because of her looks was now a woman that had to barely scrape by in life by any means necessary. She had a child, a little girl, outside of wedlock, and back in those days, well, society didn't take too kindly to such behavior for a woman. Soon, she became an outcast who lived alone in a small cabin just outside of town, where many locals said she ran an illegal blockade liquor operation, and even more scandalous, sold her favors to those willing to pay for it. Lewis Kilgore, on the other hand, was dealt a hard road to hoe in life. He never married, and after bouncing around from job to job during the 1870s, he finally took up a life of crime, embracing the chaos of the aftermath of the war between the states, riding with North Carolina outlaws like the notorious Adair brothers, robbing and stealing horses at will. Now, horse thieving might not sound like a major crime these days, but in the years that followed the Civil War, besides murder, it was the worst crime a man could commit. You see, there was a shortage of horses because of all those that were killed or stolen by Union or Confederate troops. Indeed, a good horse was rare and worth a lot of money, fetching nearly $200, which was a fortune. And Lewis Kilgore had a well-earned reputation as a horse thief and had many a lawmen and bounty hunters hot on his trail. By 1884, Lewis had made his way back to Henderson County for the first time in over 10 years, where he was attempting to lay low after a run-in with the law a few counties over for pistol whipping a man in a bar over a spilled drink. It was here that one of the most shocking crimes Kilgore ever committed happened, and it all started one September night when the outlaw was playing cards and gambling with two other men, and they run out of whiskey late into the night. One of the men suggested that he knew where they could lay their hands on some more booze, even at the late hour. So, within a few moments, the trio set out on horses into the night. Now you see, Lewis Kilgore was the type of man who would never forget old betrayals, nor would he ever forgive. And as the men rode into the dark night, there was much more than a bottle of whiskey awaiting them. And Lewis was about to get even for an old score. And what happens next would send shockwaves all across the mountains. It was about 3:30 a.m. when the outlaws made their way to the outskirts of Hendersonville when they arrived at an old cabin. But by all appearances, there wasn't anyone at home. It was completely dark and quiet. Two of the men suggested that they head on back, but Lewis was carefully looking over the cabin when he noticed a small puff of smoke coming from the chimney above. So he dismounted his horse and began to approach the porch. "Lewis, what are you doing? There's no one home, or they're in bed. Let's get out of here," one of the men shouted. But Lewis paid him no mind and began softly knocking on the door. But there was no answer, not even a stir. "Lewis, let's ride. It's late," the others called again. But Lewis gently and slowly opened the cabin door. And there in the fireplace was a few hot coals from the evening fire. Other than that, the cabin was completely dark. The liquor had to be somewhere, Lewis thought, as he slowly walked across the floor. And sure enough, on the kitchen table, there were several jugs with corncob stuffers. He leaned over and took a whiff and grinned. A few moments later, Lewis stepped out of the cabin with a jug in each hand and a big old grin on his face. But just as he stepped off the porch, he heard something move back inside of the cabin. "Lewis, we got the booze. Let's go," the others insisted. But instead, the outlaw stepped back into the cabin, and he slowly walked across the main room. He struck a match, revealing a door leading to a bedroom, and slowly walked towards it. And he could see there was a woman sleeping alone in the bed. Closer and closer he crept. When he began to make out the features of the woman's face, and in that moment, Lewis froze and his eyes widened. There before him was Maddie Henderson, the girl who had scorned his heart nearly 20 years earlier. He stepped closer for a better look. Yeah, it was her. He was certain of it. His temperature began to rise, and his teeth clenched. And then he slowly took his revolver and cocked it and placed the cold barrel against Maddie's forehead and spoke, "Sweet dreams, bitch." And he pulled the trigger. And without a flinch of a muscle, Maddie Henderson was dead. Without a hint of remorse, the killer mounted his horse and disappeared into the night. A brutal crime that he would surely get away with. But you see, Maddie had one last secret that Lewis still didn't know. And that secret was that her 7-year-old daughter was in the cabin too that night, petrified and scared, hiding under a quilt in the corner as she watched him rob and murder her mother. She saw his face by the light of the match, and by sunrise, she had identified him as Maddie's killer. By noon the next day, the law had tracked Lewis back to his hideout, where he was still passed out drunk, with the weapon that was used in the crime still strapped to his side. It was an open and shut case. Lewis Kilgore had ruthlessly killed Maddie Henderson. Kilgore's trial lasted for 4 days, and his accomplices were both found not guilty. But Lewis was convicted of first-degree murder. In front of a packed courtroom, the judge laid out his sentence. The prisoner Lewis Kilgore is remanded to the custody of the sheriff of Henderson County and is to be hanged by his neck until dead on May 6, 1886. Now, historically, this was a big event, as it would end up being the last hanging in the history of Henderson County, North Carolina. And as luck would have it, wouldn't you know it, the gallows used in the Adair brothers' hanging were still standing, and in pretty good shape too. Thus, the trap door would swing open one last time. However, the sheriff didn't want this to turn into the spectacle that the Adair brothers' execution did, when thousands of people descended on Hendersonville. So he ordered a fence to be constructed around the gallows, so it would be out of public view. But he made one mistake. You see, the good sheriff never told the workers exactly how high to make the fence, so they only built it 3 feet high. And soon, wagging tongues spread far and wide that, despite the sheriff's wishes, the big event would be for all to see. The people of Henderson County were up and at 'em early that summer day. The women had been up much of the night, cooking and packing large baskets with food to take on the trip to see the hanging. Even the children were excited. Everybody, young and old, was going to Hendersonville to see it for themselves. The crowd was in holiday spirit, laughing and talking and joking. But as that fatal hour approached, a strange silence settled over the area when the door to the jail opened and a lane was made through the packed mass of humanity as the doomed man was led to the gallows. People were standing on their tiptoes, and parents were holding their children on their shoulders so they could get a better view. Finally, the preacher began the event with a long prayer. Most everyone bowed their heads, except Lewis. In fact, he defiantly smoked a cigar and paid no mind to the words that were spoken. And when asked if he had any last words, he looked the crowd over and addressed the children who were perched on their parents' shoulders. "Youngins, you need to go to school and get a good education, or at least go to church. Unless you want to end up like me. And for the rest of you folks, I hope you enjoy this show." A few moments later, the trap door flew open and Lewis Kilgore was no more. The sheriff took his open coffin and placed it in the middle of the street so the thousands in attendance could get a good look at what the price was for murder. And as for Maddie's daughter, well, I couldn't find any records of what became of her, since her name was never mentioned in any newspaper articles. I was told that the basement of the Henderson County Courthouse still contained the records for Lewis Kilgore's trial, and they're there somewhere, but it might take months to find them. And as for Maddie's cabin, well, after this crime, folks swore that those woods surrounding it were haunted, and that Maddie still roamed them. So much so that as the town of Hendersonville grew over the next several decades, the town grew around that abandoned cabin. And by the 1950s, the property was a thick forest full of twisted pines, scrub rushes, honeysuckle vines, and blackberry briars. People passed it by the hundreds each day, never paying any attention, and the story was soon forgotten. Then one day, in 1965, the sound of bulldozers could be heard, and within a few days, all of the trees were cleared, and workers found the remains of an old fireplace. Only 6 feet of it remained. No one knew anything about it, so it was bulldozed over, and a few months later, the Dutch Inn Hotel was built on the property. It remained here for a few decades, but guests always complained about strange events taking place here, and many said it was the worst night's sleep they had ever had, and refused to stay there again. So the hotel went out of business. Then there was an Eckerd drugstore that was built here, and it too went out of business. And now a laundromat occupies the land where the most brutal crime ever committed in Hendersonville, North Carolina took place. And Lewis Kilgore, well, he was buried across the street from where Maddie lived on a rocky, abandoned hill that had worthless soil back in 1886. And today, his grave has been built over in a suburban neighborhood called Sylvan Heights. Yet, no one knows anything about it. And it's been completely forgotten. And now, my friend, you know what really happened here.